Hello, everyone. My name is Tooways. Welcome to another episode of Tooways in a Cat, a show where we talk career experiences, entrepreneurship, and investments. The main aim is to show that there's more than one way to be successful other than just climbing the corporate ladder. We are live on LinkedIn and YouTube, and the show will be available on podcast tomorrow morning. If you're joining us live, please drop a one in the comments so that we know we're not talking to ourselves. And if you're watching the recording, drop a two in the comments. My guest for this week is Thabiso Mphahlele, a data scientist who focuses on data analytics and data strategy. He also shares great career advice content on LinkedIn if you haven't seen him before. So, thanks so much for joining me today.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Ways.
Let's jump straight into questions. Tell us your
Cool.
story. Maybe where do you come from outside of work? Who is Thabiso Mphahlele?
So I'm initially currently I'm based in Tooways, Santon. But initially I grew up in Mpumalanga, Secunda. So it's like a small mining town. And so that's essentially where I grew up. I studied at the University of Pretoria, and then I moved into data analytics about 3 or so years ago. But before that, I was actually doing a lot of freelance work in terms of digital marketing and whatever else. But I think after some time, I grew tired of that. Like I missed the mathematics and whatever. So I was like, I think I need to find a way to incorporate these, and that's sort of what led me into data analytics, and it's been an interesting ride so far.
Okay. We had very, very short summary, but hopefully we'll get some more info out of you. So, I mean, like you say, you're a data professional, but what does that mean on a day-to-day? What do you do on a day-to-day basis? Because most of us don't know what data professionals do.
Okay, so it's a broad spectrum, and I think it's a conversation that still confuses a lot of people about data analytics, what actually that is, and especially with the advent of people talking about the fourth industrial revolution, like what exactly is that, and how does that impact me specifically? So a lot of my work, 9 to 5, is centered mostly around working with customer experience data. So if you've ever let's say worked with something like DSTV or whatever else, generally they'll send you a survey and say, how was your experience with this and whatever else. So we generally will analyze that data. So we try to basically derive some level of business insights around their customers, how they're experiencing the current service across that different touch points. So a lot of my work is centered around that, but also there's a lot of ad hoc requests from the clients themselves. That's generally more statistical than perhaps the average data scientist may encounter. And that's where it's really statistics heavy. So you really have to look into the literature, look at the research, look at other articles, like is there even precedent for the way in which you're trying to solve the client's current problem. So a lot of my work is really like researching articles, reading that, how did they solve a similar problem, and how's that problem related to this specific client request right now, and modeling that. Obviously, currently I use R, modeling that, but then obviously still the conversation is around, okay, then what do I do with this information? So you still have to then bring it towards their specific business context. This is what it means for your business. Like this is what this model and this outcome actually means for your business. So a lot of my work is around that. Like it's really the gathering of the data. What do you do with it? Modeling it, and also then explaining it to the client, or generally we've got account managers, explaining it to the account manager to actually say, this is actually what's happening with this specific project, and this is perhaps what they could do with that.
Okay. I mean, so you've touched on it a little bit, but I'm going to ask it again, just in terms of, you mentioned in our discussions before that businesses are not using data as an asset. You mentioned that they're not using proper data strategies. But again, practically, what does that mean? Like, how do you leverage data that you have? Like, what does it mean for the person who is not involved in data and has no idea about it? If you explain it to us.
Okay, I'll try and develop, I guess, an example of sorts. And I think the problem most companies actually have is, and this is with my huge fascination of late with data strategies is they've got their specific objectives. Let's say over the next 3 years, we really want to ramp up our e-commerce. We really want to ramp up how much the percentage of our revenue coming in from our websites and whatever else. No problem. But they will still then not track. So where now data analytics comes in and the data strategy is like, okay, this is the business objective. Now, how will we know that we are on the right track over these next 3 years? We shouldn't wait for the next 3 years to know this. Like, how will we actually know that we are moving in the right direction as an organization based on our specific business objectives? And then where the data strategy now comes into the picture, that's where we say, okay, here are the key metrics that would basically serve as signals towards the specific objective. If these specific key metrics are moving in the right direction, then we will know that we as an organization are moving in the right direction. And then the question then becomes, okay, if these are the key metrics, then what information is going to inform these metrics? And that's where now the data comes in. That's where the data strategy comes in. It's like, okay, so then what information do we need to be collecting? How do we collect that information? How do we store that information? What are the legal implications of storing this information? And once we've stored this information, how do we analyze this information based on our specific key metrics? And once we have all of those working together, that encompasses the entire business strategy in line with the business objectives. Then let's just take this e-commerce example as an example. In that instance, then we want to say, okay, let's start tracking our customer behavior on our site. What is it that they do? Do we find instances where someone clicks on a product, goes to cart, and then just abandons it? What causes that? What is it that's happening? Like, is the payment page on our website too difficult to understand? Like, where are those pain points? And so once you start actually then analyzing in that instance, that's where now the data now serves a huge benefit to you. That's where now it becomes an actual asset, because you are using it in line with your specific business objectives. And I think that's where the breakdown generally occurs with companies, where they're not too sure how then do we incorporate the data with what we're trying to achieve. But that's basically a summary of how the strategy comes into play. Like, this is what we're trying to do. And then the business objective, the business strategy is supposed to inform the data strategy, not the other way around. Like, you have conversations at times with clients and they'll be like, no, just look at the data. The answer must be there. And you're like, but the answer to what? You understand? So, and that's where a lot of the confusion actually stems from. You're like, okay, we've got all this data, but you're like, do you have the right data? Have we actually been collecting the right stuff? Have we been tracking the right things? Outside of that, the data itself is basically meaningless.
So I take it Poppy is not your friend then.
It's been a difficult thing to, I think, one, make sense of what it means. Two, then what does that mean for, especially in the context of data collection and the data management. But if you want to regard it as evil, it's a necessary evil.
Okay. And for the audience, we'll be responding to questions towards the end. So if you've got any questions for Thabiso, please add them to the comment section now so that we don't miss them. Mm-hmm. So Thabiso, let's say there's a professional out there, maybe a young professional, not a data professional. Mm-hmm. How can they best learn about data management in a way that's maybe cost effective for them and maybe will improve their skills? So maybe it makes them more employable, or it just makes them more knowledgeable. So not necessarily that they become an expert like you, but makes them more knowledgeable and makes them add more value in a boardroom or in a management meeting.
Cool. So there's this idea that I really like. I keep attributing it to our CEO, but I'm not sure if he was actually the person that I heard actually say this. Is you want to know enough to be dangerous. So you want to actually know enough to hold a conversation. So you don't necessarily need to become a data professional, but I mean, in every industry, there is that set of like 5 or so books that are essentially gospel to that industry itself. So I would start because I read a lot of books. Generally, that's where I would actually start. You're like, read the fundamental books of the concept itself. Read the books on what actually drives this. Obviously, those would be the books in the context of data science. elements of statistical learning. Those are generally the the beginning places. You make sure that you at least understand like the basic vocabulary of data science, and then how that then informs your specific business context. So even if you're not trying to basically become a full-on data professional, but at the very least understanding the basic vocabularies. And in the instance where your organization ends up actually moving into data, you have a base understanding, a conceptual understanding of what that means and what that actually looks like when you're actually looking at some of the reports and whatever. So I would go about it that way. Like I'd look at some of the books, like the statistics, definitely. Not so much the BI tools, but you could actually look at some of the BI tools that are out there and whatever. But I think because you won't be doing most of the heavy lifting, you don't really need to go into all of that, but you want to actually understand what you're looking at. So definitely I would, I think it's 2 books. There's the elements of statistical learning, I believe, and then there's the introduction to statistical learning. That book is actually really, really, really rudimentary. It's an entry point book that really, it starts with machine learning from the very beginning. Like, what is it? What does it look like? What's the program actually doing in terms of your data? Which types of models for specific problems and whatever. So definitely I would look at books of that nature. There's all sorts of materials, even on, like, let's say YouTube, Udemy and whatever. So like the learning, I think especially now with it being dubbed the sexiest occupation in the world, it's very easy to really get your hands on a specific set of information that could really get you going.
Okay, so I mean it's a good something to read. So let's say again I've come to watch the show, listen to this discussion, and I've decided, okay, I want to make use of data for the company that I work for. What do you think is my first step other than reading the books?
Cool. So it depends on, I'm assuming that you've been with the company long enough that you understand the company itself. And yes, you have a base understanding of what is it that they're actually trying to achieve. So yes, let's say over the next 18 or so months. So obviously the next thing is a quick win. So it could be, I'm trying to think of an actual example in the context of an actual business case. Let's say you're working for a retail company that sells sneakers, and so they've been moving heavily towards opening stores in every mall and whatever else. And now you are thinking, okay, now how can we then use data to actually then inform that? Many of these stores also have online stores, so one of the easiest things you could actually do is just basically move into Google Analytics and actually start tracking that. Like you start tracking, okay, this is where most of the people that land on our page actually come from. Are we actually doing enough in terms of our marketing on that page? That's a win on its own, because that's not necessarily an obvious thing. Like you would think we're a business or we're a B2B business, so we should be focusing on LinkedIn, only to find that most of the traffic to your site, where someone perhaps does a call to action and whatever else, is coming in from Facebook. So even though you're a B2B company, most of your requests are actually only coming in from Facebook. You won't necessarily know that. But if you were to actually look at, let's say, the website data on the company website and say, oh, okay, this is actually where most of our traffic is coming from, we might be onto something there. Are we doing enough in that regard? What else could we do there? And that's a quick win, because the powers that be might not actually know that. So I would look at where money is already going in terms of like web hosting. Perhaps you are already, if we carry on with the retail example, if you're still in the, if your specific organization is already moved into like your big retailers, like where are we selling the best, and what's the top seller, and why is that the case? You understand? So those are some of the things that I remember. I think it was about 5 or so months ago, when I was working with a supply network, and one of their products, which was actually a very interesting discovery, is Pick n Pay has different types of stores. They're not all the same. And depending on the length of the aisle before you pay, actually affected the revenues of the specific product because it was actually in that app.
Interesting.
So that wasn't actually an obvious instance where you would have known that outside of actually looking at the data itself, looking at the sales, looking at, oh, wait, there's actually a difference in your top sellers. Your top sellers are actually stores with these long aisles and whatever else. So perhaps we want to invest more towards getting perhaps more shelf space in those stores. That's a very quick win because you're already paying for the data and whatever. So I would look at instances like that. Like I wouldn't necessarily move into like machine learning and whatever else. Like where's the money in the business already going and how do we optimize those investments already?
Low-hanging fruit. I like that because Google. I mean, Google Analytics. Even if somebody's got a small business that's got a website, they can do that if they do.
100%.
So, okay, that's great. So let's switch gears a little bit. I mean, you're into data analytics and all those things, but then why did you decide to start putting out content on LinkedIn, and why did you focus on careers?
So how I actually ended up on LinkedIn, I think is I think about a lot of things. Like I'm not married to data analytics. I'm interested in problem solving. So if I woke up tomorrow and I found there's an easier way to solve the types of problems that I'm interested in, I would leave data analytics. So I'm not married to that. So a lot of the times, I would spend a lot of time with my wife, and actually would be talking, and I'd be talking about my career. I'm like, I'm actually thinking about this. I'm actually thinking about this today, and whatever else. And my current theory is that she got tired of hearing me talk about these things from day to day. And so she was the one that actually said, you should actually record this and put this on LinkedIn. I think people would actually resonate with that because you think about your career so often, and so that's essentially how I ended up on LinkedIn. I think it was about a year, just over a year ago, that I started doing that on LinkedIn. And that's essentially how I ended up there. Like, it's like these were conversations that I was already having with individuals offline, but I was, I guess, coerced into moving them online and say, okay, well, there might be more people that resonate with your thought process, and perhaps it could even help them in terms of moving their specific careers forward.
So if anybody hasn't checked out your Thabiso's profile, and especially if you're a young professional, have a look. He gives you some great career advice. Looking at your LinkedIn profile, I noticed also that you've done quite a bit of training on, and you've got quite a few Udemy certifications. So my question on Udemy certification specifically is, was it of value to you? And would you recommend others invest the time and the money to get similar Udemy certifications?
Yes. Like, I think what's interesting is I think I've only had one instance where someone questioned the credibility of my work. Like every other instance, no one really cares where the information actually comes from. It needn't necessarily come from a university. Can you actually solve my problem? And how will you actually go about doing that? You understand? So like Udemy is a cheap option. Like you're paying $100, $200 for a specific course and whatever else. And a lot of them are actually really good. I think over the past while, I've spent a lot of time doing strategy courses and whatever else, but most of them are aligned towards business strategy, and the value is there. Like these people actually know what they are talking about, So I would definitely recommend it. Like irrespective of what it is that you're trying to learn, there's real benefit in doing that, and it allows you to really bring a lot more value towards even in the teams that you're a part of. Like there may be problems that maybe plaguing the team or the organization that you're a part of that you are interested enough to learn how to solve. Yeah. And if you're willing to put in, let's say, a week or 2 weeks towards learning on Udemy, you can come back 2 weeks later and say, oh, wait, I actually know how to solve this. It's not that complicated. You understand? So for me, that's really where I find a lot of the benefit in terms of Udemy and whatever else is that you can go for a day, 2 days, or even a week, come back next week to a specific problem in the organization and say, oh, I know how to solve it. So I think that's where for
spend a
me,
year going to university.
I mean, obviously, like it's minus the 3 years, So yeah, for me, it's a huge resource. Like I use it for almost everything, but it's generally after I've actually read the books and whatever else. But I do use it a lot. I really, really, really recommend it to anyone.
Okay. Tell me, what's one piece of advice you would give your younger self?
Make more mistakes. That would definitely be the advice I would give, because
Short and sweet.
and there's a reason for that. Like, I think, especially when you come of age and you really become so self-conscious, you're afraid of making any wrong step. Like, you're afraid, what if I choose the wrong course in varsity? What if I marry the wrong person? What if I move to the wrong company? And you're like, look at the worst case scenario, especially if you're young. Like, the worst case scenario, you study the wrong course, you can study something else. Like, it's not the end of the world. Like, outside of it actually killing you, chances are you would actually survive it. You will, especially if you're young, like, you will actually survive it. So it's like, if you consider the word, and it's still a decision making framework I have right now. It's like, okay, let's consider the worst case scenario. What's the worst that could possibly happen if we decide to do this? And if it's something that we would actually survive, let's say you're considering moving from one organization to the next, and you're like, okay, but now what happens if I get there and it's the wrong move? But then you move to the next one. So it's I think we have this finality about life that we feel as though if you make one wrong move, then it's over. That's not true. Like, you actually want to make more mistakes. You actually want to try more things. And that's really how you solve more problems. I mean, most of the things I do fail. I get it wrong most of the time. But every now and then you find that one thing or two things that really work out for you extremely well. And generally that's what you get praised for, not knowing that there were like 99 or 100 failures prior to that. So that's one thing I would actually say to myself then, is like, it's not that serious. Like, no one's watching you. Like, no one really cares. You're like, what are my friends gonna, like, no one really cares.
They're all political problems. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. So I would really say that, like, dude, like, it's not that serious. Make the mistakes, find your way, like, try more things. And you'll find every now and then you'll hit upon something. Every now and then you will hit upon something. And those are those huge wins that people actually look at. I mean, prior to actually posting on LinkedIn, I was posting on Instagram. No one was interested. You'd get like one view in like 5 days. And you're like, clearly I'm in the wrong place. Let's try the same thing elsewhere. You understand? So it's like, try more things. Eventually you find what works.
Let's move over to questions. We got one question that just came through. Question from Jake's house. A follow-up question on making more mistakes. How do you overcome these mistakes when you make them? Good question.
Okay, I'll use this as an example. Earlier this year, I made a decision to move from Gen X to a different company. I knew within about a week that this was the wrong choice. Within about a week, because I'm also studying part-time. So you spend a lot of time at work and whatever. It's like so obviously your time that you spend away from your actual studies has to really be something that you feel like is actually moving you forward. So I knew within about a week, perhaps 2 weeks, I was like, okay, this was bad. And because I'm such an open person, like, I think a lot of it is, don't pretend that's not the case. Like, you're an accountant, you probably know better than me. There's the idea of sunk costs. Like, I've already invested so much into this, I need to keep investing into it. Like, no, if you figure out quickly that it's failing, like, get over it. So I realized very quickly, and I'm like, okay, clearly this is not going to work. And I spoke to my then boss immediately within a few weeks. I think I was there 3 weeks. And I said, listen, I'm kind of bored. I really need to, I'm not too sure this is going to work out. And then, we spoke about that, but I was very clear about that, So one of the things I do is I don't take my ideas personally. Like, I've got a new idea that I'm working on. If it fails, it fails. Like, that is not a reflection of me. Like, based on the information I had at that time, it sounded like it would work on paper. But there's I think it's Robert Greene who talks about this idea of friction. I think it's a military term, like the difference between what you plan for when you're planning the war versus what you actually encounter in war. that difference is called friction. Like, there's always friction in your plans. So if you encounter an instance where you realize quickly, and I set metrics, it's one of the things that I really like. I'm not a huge believer in trust the process. I'm like, no, I don't trust the process, trust the metrics. Okay, because if you are eating, let's say, 5 pies a day, and you're like, I'm trusting the process, sooner or later I'm going to get into shape. No, that's not how it works. Like when you get on that scale and it keeps going higher, trust that metric. You are doing something wrong. You understand? So that's really what I've learned how to do. I've really learned not to take my ideas personally. Like I test them out, and if they don't work, how quickly will I know they're not working? And that's where really metrics help me. I set metrics for the teams I'm a part of, the organizations I join, the types of opportunities I consider. I'm like, okay, obviously you won't know everything from the outside. This specific opportunity sounded great from the outside, only to when you get there, you realize, okay, listen, there's way too much friction for me to really do anything about this. So that's really what I do. Like, don't take your ideas personally. Like if you make a decision, it was a decision that you made and you made it in good faith, but you didn't have all of the information. There are some things that you couldn't have taken into account. So when you get there and you realize, okay, this was clearly a mistake, discover that quickly. The fact that you've got sunk costs is irrelevant. Like investing more time and effort into something that you know isn't going to work, isn't going to make it work. And I think that's where we really lose ourselves. Like you realize very quickly that you are part of a company that isn't going to move your career forward. Discover that quickly and make peace with that idea. If you realize that you don't like the job that you're doing, no problem. Find something else. That doesn't mean quit. It's coming to that realization and accepting that decision is like, okay, this was clearly a mistake. It took me a further 2 months before I left that organization. But I knew a month in, I was like, clearly this is not going to work. But as soon as you realize that, you're like, okay, now let's start charting a path forward to the next thing.
And I mean, if I can add anything to that, is don't beat yourself up about it.
Exactly.
Because it helps no one. And nobody, like we said, don't worry about other people's judgment. Don't beat yourself up about it. There's always learning. So what can I learn from this that I can use going forward? And then you move on. That's the best. For me, that's the best way.
100%.
It looks like all the questions are done. Are there any last few words from you or anything that we didn't discuss that you'd like the audience to know?
Like, I think we really underestimate, and I'm not too sure what causes this. Most of the people that I really talk to, because of the content that I really share, they feel so powerless in their careers and the trajectory of their careers. Like, you're in more control than you actually realize. You're in more control than you actually realize in terms of the specific trajectory of your career. And I think that's one of the things that I would actually share with people. I'm like, you would be shocked how much control you are actually in. Like, you have the upper hand. You actually have the upper hand. Like, the company you work for has competitors. There's only one you.
Okay, make it a bit more practical. I am with you, but make it a bit more practical for the
If you feel like you're in a dead-end company and you feel like the promotions are not coming, you feel like what you feel like you should be paid, you're not being paid that and whatever else, you don't have to stay. You don't have to stay. Like, you can actually make it. And just because you've been in one career for like 10 years doesn't mean you have to be there another 10 years. Like, you can actually do something else. And the thing about it is you've actually built up such a huge safety net that if it doesn't work, you can always go back to what you've always been doing. So for me, that's really one of the things that, exactly, so it's one of the things that I feel like we really understate. Like, you've got more control than you realize. And I think it's part of why I almost discourage reading the news and watching the news and whatever, because if you're going to focus on like the high unemployment rate, this and that, like there are no jobs out there, that's not possibly true. Like there are jobs out there because there are still people that have problems that they would pay you to actually solve. You understand? It's just that there aren't enough organizations that can offer you permanent roles. You're like, okay, well, you don't necessarily need that. If you can solve projects, you can actually work on a project basis, and you'll still be able to find organizations that would be able to pay you to do that. Like, as long as they are human beings, there'll be problems. And as long as there are problems, there'll be people that are willing to pay you to solve them. So you're not as powerless as perhaps someone would want you to actually feel. So I think that's one of the things that I would actually share with people. Like you are actually in a lot more control than you really realize.
That's a great way to end the show. A reminder to everyone that the show has been live on YouTube and will be on podcast tomorrow. If you're watching on YouTube or listening on the podcast and you feel that it's added value to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click on the notification bell so that you get automatically notified when the next episode comes out. Thabiso, thank you so much for your time.
Awesome, man. This was fun.